Hello, everybody. My name is Graham Elwood, and you are watching, boom, the Political Vigilante. Well, a great way to support the show is do what Tim Stack has done and go to patreon.com/Graham Elwood, where you can submit articles like this. I wanted to talk about this because we just had the Nicaragua election. And so the Facebook team that tried to swing Nicaragua's election is full of U.S. spies. Well, that's shocking. Usually social media is just for the people. And everyone in Silicon Valley, they're just fun-loving hipsters. They wear skateboard shoes, right? We've studied this over and over. A tacit agreement between the government and Facebook appears to have been made. You can keep the profits, but we control the message. As such, a cynic might wonder what functional difference there is between Facebook and the national security state. This was in Mint Press News. I'm going to just go over this real quick. We're going to have Ben weigh in to unpack this for us, right? So less than a week before Nicaragua's presidential election, social media giant Facebook deleted the accounts of hundreds of the country's top news outlets, journalists, and activists. Boy, that's never happened. All of them supported the ruling left-wing Sandinista government, a top Washington target for regime change. Boy, have we ever heard this story before? There's a left-wing government that wants to empower the people. They're not going to give up their land and their resources to American corporations. So the State Department comes in and says, oh, no, your problems, you're terrorists. It's bad. It's bad. It's bad. Like if you ever watch Government Secrets with Lee Camp and myself, you know that this is the playbook. This is the playbook. And every time it's always like the socialists got to power. Oh, they're terrorists. They're communists. They're beating their own people. Whatever the lie is always pushed, right? So that's what they uncovered in Mint Press News, of course. This is a quote. This is appalling interference by Facebook in particular, which is the most popular social media outlet in Nicaragua. They allege that they've stopped a government-deployed troll farm, but what they have actually done is to close accounts of ordinary Sandinista activists, particularly young people, often with many followers. So we know we've had Susie Dawson on the show. We know this is what they do. Activists that can get the message out, people with big followings, they're targeted. I've been targeted, right? Other people that we know have been targeted, Lee Camp, Jimmy, we've all been targeted because that's what happens when you start getting regular people involved and you can't do anything that goes against the State Department. So the propaganda arm keeps, now this was in CNN, right? Ortega wins in Nicaragua elections panned as parody by international observers. Who are these international observers? They all, I'm sure, part of the Five Eyes, I'm sure. So I'm kind of familiar with what's been going on in Nicaragua, but I wanted to bring on Ben Norton to the show. He's never been on the show before, but he is really can shed some light on the specifics of how, once again, America really hates democracy. Like, we really hate it. Let's be clear. We hate democracy. When corporations win, then it's okay. But when the people, nope. So here he is, who's done a lot of reporting on this, I believe on the Gray Zone and other outlets. Ladies and gentlemen, Ben Norton.
Hey, thanks for having me. It's good to be here, Graham. First time on the show.
Yeah, I really appreciate you. I know you're busy. You're doing the whole, the indie left interview circuit as it is. But I really wanted for you to shed light on basically give everybody anyone who's watching who maybe hasn't been paying as much attention to how this has played out and what this election means to the United States and why they're so against the Sandinistas.
Well, you hit the nail on the head where if you look at Washington's foreign policy for well over 100 years now, it's clear there's a central theme. We don't care about democracy. All we actually care about is more and more profits, control of natural resources, control of geostrategic locations so we can have trade and dominate international trade and make more money. And we've seen this again and again, especially in Latin America. In the 1820s, this is 200 years ago, the U.S. government declared the Monroe Doctrine, which basically said that Latin America belongs to the U.S. empire. No other powers should intervene in Latin America because it's ours. It's our backyard, proverbially. So this policy that we've seen against Nicaragua is far from new. If anyone knows anything about Nicaragua and the U.S., they probably remember vaguely that in the 1980s, the CIA armed and trained these far-right death squads called the Contras. This was the Ronald Reagan administration, We know that the CIA was training them, giving them weapons. And one of the former leaders of the Contras wrote an article in the New York Times in which he admitted, it was like a big tell-all. He said, terrorism is the most effective weapon of the CIA-backed Contras. That's an exact quote. And he said, this is another exact quote. He wrote that the Contras burn down schools and hospitals faster than the Sandinistas can build them. So who are the Sandinistas? In 1979, there was a socialist revolution in Nicaragua led by the Sandinista National Liberation Front. The Sandinistas are a leftist group, but they're also kind of unique. They also have elements of liberation theology, of like a progressive form of Christianity. They're not all revolutionary movements around the world are the same. They're very unique. But what does tie them together, unlike other, in addition to other leftist movements, there's one common thread, of course. They have universal education, free healthcare at all levels. They have housing programs, jobs programs, all of these social programs. Really, the short of it is that the government uses the money that they have to actually help people, to help poor people, to fight poverty, to provide education and healthcare. And to foreign corporations and to the U.S. government, that's a threat. That's the threat of a good example, because if a poor country like Nicaragua, which is the second poorest country in the Western Hemisphere after Haiti, if they can provide free healthcare and education at all levels, then why can't the richest country in the world, or now the second richest, because China just overtook the U.S. So the U.S. has been meddling in Nicaragua for many decades, just as, the U.S. has been trying to crush the Cuban Revolution ever since that succeeded in 1959. And the U.S. is trying to crush Venezuela. And the U.S. backed a military coup in Bolivia 2 years ago. In November of 2019, it was a blatantly far-right military coup against the elected president, Evo Morales. And what was his crime? Again, it was being a socialist. So this is the common theme. Now, for the elections that we saw most recently, of course, the so-called threat is that the Sandinistas are the most popular party, the Sandinista Front. And it's not a surprise why. Now, there's a lot of propaganda saying that the Sandinistas are the reason that they're still in power is because they oppress the opposition and they control everything. It's right. Ridiculous. I'm in Nicaragua. I actually live here. And I was an electoral observer. I've been here a long time. I understand how it works. No, the reason they're the most popular party by far is because of all the things I just named. They're the only party in the history of this country that has provided healthcare and education and housing and jobs. They've delivered it. They've actually done it. Whereas in the U.S., sometimes some Democrats will say, oh, well, we want healthcare and education, but they never deliver it. And many of them don't even pretend like they want universal healthcare. We've seen how many Democrats, the leaders of the Democratic Party, have gone against Medicare for all and against, universal higher education. So that's why the Sandinistas are popular. And the so-called threat is that they are still in power and they won the elections.
Yeah. And I mean, just to interject specific to the Republicans and Democrats, I just did a video for Straight Arrow News. And if you go to Open Secrets, you can see the healthcare lobby, the big pharmaceutical companies donate pretty evenly, almost down the line. Sometimes it's, 49-51, 48-52 to both parties. Like they just so then we maybe we'll get some lip service on, we're going to fight for Medicare for all. And they can't seem to figure it out when the bill is coming. So it's like, it's so hilarious to me that these so-called poor countries are viewed as just this it's just anarchy. They don't have anything. And thank God we're here in America where you can, file for bankruptcy for medical debt or just die because you're turned down because you don't have health insurance. And then, these evil Sandinistas, the social, I mean, just about every country, you name several of them, but I mean, literally, but we could, Venezuela. I mean, honestly, Chavez did similar stuff. I mean, they always help the people. And then it's like, nope, we got to get them out of there. We'll call them whatever we got to call them. So I just wanted to interject that, but I'm sorry, go ahead in terms of why. So you just outlined why the Sandinistas are so popular. Shocking. They get stuff for the people and not the oligarchs. That's who knew. Wow. Who saw that coming?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is a crusade, really. The U.S. since the 1980s has been obsessed with trying to destroy the Sandinista revolution. And in 1990, they briefly succeeded. And what's incredible is there's all these narratives that the Sandinistas are authoritarian and all this. But in 1990, there was a democratic election and the Sandinistas lost. And it was totally unfair, of course. I mentioned that in the 1980s, the U.S. government, the CIA, was supporting these far-right death squads, the Contras, who were killing people. They killed tens of thousands of people. They terrorized the country. They blew up bridges and roads. Also, there was a U.S. blockade, just like the U.S. blockade of Cuba and the U.S. blockade of Venezuela. So anytime a left-wing government comes to power and they nationalize their oil, like in Venezuela, and they kick out the foreign corporations, then the U.S. suffocates them with sanctions. And then just as like a little kid will like hit you and then say, why are you hitting yourself? Hit you with your arm, be like, why are you hitting yourself? Why are you hitting yourself? That's what the U.S. does economically at a geopolitical level. It suffocates countries economically, and then it refuses to recognize the elections until the right wing wins. And in 1990, the right wing, funded by the U.S. government with their campaign created by the CIA, they won the election. And the so-called authoritarian Sandinistas, they said, okay, we lost the election. We're going to leave power, which is the first time actually in history, at least modern history, where a revolutionary movement that took power through an armed struggle against a U.S.-backed dictatorship, they lost in an election and they voluntarily gave up power. That had never happened before, but we're supposed to believe the Sandinistas are so authoritarian. So for 16 years, actually for 17 years, from 1990 until 2007, there were multiple right-wing neoliberal governments in Nicaragua. They privatized all the social programs. They privatized education, privatized healthcare, privatized the water grid, privatized the electrical grid. They sold off the railroads to U.S. companies. They did all of the Washington consensus, the neoliberal economics that we're told is for efficiency and all this. And the country became even poorer. The economy didn't grow. There were fewer jobs, unemployment increased, inequality skyrocketed. There was more violence and drug trafficking and all of this. Surprise. And then in 2006, the Sandinistas came back to power through democratic elections. They won the 2006 elections and they came back to power in 2007. And they've continued winning the elections ever since. And the U.S. has been desperate to try to overthrow them. And, you know, people ask why all the time. Well, think about what they did in the U.S. Look what they did to Bernie Sanders, who wasn't even like that radical. I mean, he's in Europe, he would be considered a center or center-left candidate, right? But look at how the extreme measures that the U.S. oligarchy went to, the media outlets, the DNC leadership, they went to such an extreme degree. They went to so many extreme levels to try to rig the election against Bernie Sanders. They successfully did so 2 times. And so imagine what they do abroad. That was internally in the U.S.'s own politics. I mean, we have to understand that the U.S. is an oligarchy. There's nothing resembling democracy in the U.S. You have 2 factions of the same oligarchic capitalist party that agrees on all of the same politics, all the same policies. There's a 5% difference on cultural issues, but when it comes to economic issues and political issues and foreign policy, it's all the same. And so abroad, they enforce those same policies, and they use the military to do it. In the case of Iraq, in the case of Syria, in the case of Libya, Libya had been the most prosperous country in Africa, and now it's a failed state with open-air slave markets. And then if they can't do it militarily, they do it through the CIA. They do it through funding so-called nonprofit organizations. They do it through funding extreme right-wing media propaganda, and they do it through meddling in so many other countless ways. Sanctions, cyber attacks. I mean, it's hybrid warfare is what it's called. And unfortunately, the U.S. is continuing to wage hybrid warfare against tons of countries all around the world. I mean, we could spend the entire time just naming the list of the countries being targeted with foreign meddling, which is way worse than anything that Russia was even accused of in Russiagate, which was like Facebook memes.
Yeah. Yeah. It's yeah. They spent $100,000 or some big whopping number like that. I saw one guy from Google in front of Congress, and they asked how much money was spent on Google ads to try to sway the election. He said $2,500. And he said that in front of Congress. And I was like, wow, boy. I mean, you know, a $1.5 billion that Hillary had, that's no match for $2,500. I mean, that's like, oh my God, that's like a big mortgage payment for 1 month or something. That's nuts. So I wanted to and obviously, yeah, all of the ways the United States empire is just crucifying anybody that wants democracy, and yet we claim we want democracy, and then we destabilize countries so they become chaotic, and then we go, oh, we had no choice, we got to send our military in or whatever, just to justify more military spending. But
then, as Trump said, we have to keep the oil. He just openly admitted it. The U.S. has troops in Syria, and Trump was like, we're leaving them there to take the oil. And they're still there with Biden, by the way, and they're still taking the oil.
Of course, because there's very little difference, like, as you pointed out, between both parties. There's like a 5% difference in cultural issues. The one party gets a lot of money from, the Republicans get money from the NRA, the Democrats get money from AIPAC. That's about, abortion, gun control. Even gun control is lip service by the Democrats. They don't really give a shit. I mean, if they really, Obama could have done it when he had power. The Democrats could have done it. That's all even just talk. That's just this football that they want to kick back and forth on the corporate media. But so what specifically just happened with this election? Ortega won, right? So the Sandinistas are still in power. And what has been the leading up to that? And what is the reaction? I mean, you're there, like, on the streets. What leading up to the election and the reaction afterwards? What is the difference between what you're seeing and hearing in the press in Nicaragua versus what, like, I just showed that CNN ridiculous article or whatever?
Yeah. So polls consistently over many months, this is not new. Polls have consistently shown that the government, which is led by President Ortega and he himself, they have support that fluctuates between like 60 and 70%. So about 2/3 of the population, which is pretty good. I mean, especially for the region. Look at Biden's polls. I mean, there are people who are opposed to the government and there are opposition forces, but they're a minority, right? So the government is quite popular, in especially in the context of Latin America. And there are a few talking points used to try to discredit the government. Now, one of the talking points that is true, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's undemocratic, is that Ortega has been in power since 2007, and that this is his fourth term, and it's probably going to be his last term. He's pretty old, and it's very likely this will be his final term. So he still hasn't been in power as long as Angela Merkel in Germany, by the way, but he's called a dictator because he's in his fourth term. Now, this was the same talking point used to, his fourth term begins in January. This is the same talking point that was used to demonize Evo Morales, the socialist president in Bolivia, who again was democratically elected. And in 2019, in the October elections, he freely and fairly won the election. But there was this claim that he's a dictator because he's entering his fourth term. Now, whatever, you can criticize governments for that, but the reality is that if you have a very popular leader and they are effective and competent and people like them, then you can say that actually in some ways term limits are kind of undemocratic. And there's a lot of liberals in the US who obsess over Obama. They worship Obama and they would love him to have a third and a fourth term. They joke about it all the time. But if you actually have a popular left-wing leader who wins the elections again and again, then, I mean, I don't see any problem with having a fourth term if he's actually still popular. Of course, that was used to justify the coup in Bolivia in 2019. What's not that well known, because the coup in Bolivia succeeded, it's well known. But the year before, there was a trial run for the coup in Bolivia here in Nicaragua in 2018. There was a very violent coup attempt with tons of millions of dollars in U.S. government funding to these very violent right-wing elements that tried to overthrow the government here in Nicaragua. And by the way, in 2017, the year before that, there was another very violent coup attempt in Venezuela against the elected socialist government there. So, like I said, if you have a socialist government that comes to power, even if it's through democratic elections, the U.S. will spend millions of dollars funding these extremist groups. And if they can't win the elections, as we saw this past week in Venezuela, then the U.S. tries to discredit the elections. So, and then in addition, they try a violent coup attempt. Now, the coup attempt in Nicaragua failed after 2018. It did succeed in 2019 in Bolivia. And now, going forward, after the coup attempt, the Nicaraguan government arrested some of the coup leaders because, shocker, in Nicaragua, it's illegal to take millions of dollars from a foreign government and organize a coup attempt, a violent coup attempt. That's illegal pretty much in every country in the world, last time I checked. It's definitely illegal in the U.S. So in Nicaragua, there were people who were involved in the coup attempt who were arrested, and they were charged with money laundering because we have documents showing they took millions of dollars from the U.S. government to these organizations, and then much of that money went into their bank accounts, which is money laundering, and others charged with violence and coup plotting and all of this. So there was this narrative. I mean, these people were all funded by the U.S. government. So the U.S. government started this narrative that Ortega was imprisoning all of the presidential hopefuls, all of his so-called opponents. Now, there were opposition figures who participated in the elections. They weren't the people who organized the coup attempt, but there were candidates. And I've published in my reporting, I published a 10-minute video, like a short documentary about the elections. I published an article, and anyone can go to the Gray Zone and check out the photo of the ballot. I took photos of the ballot. There were 6 options on the ballot. 5 of the options were right-wing parties. One of the options was the party of President Ortega, the Sandinista Front. So there were 5 other opposition candidates that were on the ballot. They participated in the vote. They won hundreds of thousands of votes in the election. But the narrative was that because the coup leaders funded by the U.S. government were arrested, that supposedly the election was illegitimate because he supposedly arrested presidential hopefuls, which doesn't mean anything. I mean, I often point out Kanye West is a presidential hopeful. I mean, you could say that we are presidential hopefuls. If you, Graham, if you want to be president one day, you're a presidential hopeful. So if you take millions of dollars from Russia to organize a violent coup attempt in the U.S. and you're arrested, then you could just say, "Oh, I'm a presidential hopeful, and the U.S. is politically persecuting me. I'm a political prisoner because I want to be president someday." So that's the narrative used to try to discredit the elections in Nicaragua.
Wow. I mean, it's like, and boy, we will really do every tactic possible that we can to do this. So now that Ortega's won, he's going to start. You said I think his 4th term in January. And they tried and failed. So what do you see the CIA and the U.S. State Department? What do you think they're going to try to do next?
Well, it's the same playbook used in Venezuela. I mean, so much of what's going on in Nicaragua is play by play the exact same blueprint that the U.S. used against Venezuela. So in Venezuela, Hugo Chavez launched the Bolivarian Revolution. He came to power through democratic elections in 1998 and came to power. And then he won election after election because he was extremely popular. Because, again, surprise, if you're the only leader in the modern history of your country that uses the tax dollars to actually create healthcare and education and housing and job programs and all of the social programs, you're going to be popular. So Chavez was very popular. He declared the Bolivarian Revolution. He started denouncing U.S. meddling and U.S. imperialism. He gave this incredible speech at the United Nations right after George Bush. And he went up on the stage and he said, "Smells like sulfur." And he said, George Bush is literally Satan in his speech. I mean, he just went off and all of this. He denounced the Iraq War. So you have these very charismatic, popular leaders that denounce the U.S. on the international stage. And of course, Washington gets really angry. So there was a coup against Hugo Chavez in Venezuela in 2002. Again, this is the democratically elected president. There was a briefly successful military coup against him. We now have all the documents showing that the George Bush administration was deeply involved in supporting this coup. And they overthrew Chavez for a few days, and they replaced him immediately with a right-wing multimillionaire oligarch named Pedro Carmona, who immediately tried to privatize the oil. Like in like 2 days, he tried to privatize the oil. And Chavez was so popular that the people of Venezuela went out into the streets and they overthrew the coup regime. And Chavez came back to power, the democratically elected left-wing leftist president, socialist president. So he was in power, and then he died in 2013 in very shady circumstances, I should say. And then there was another election right after he died in 2013, and Nicolas Maduro, who was his vice president, won those elections. And since then, Maduro has won the presidential elections, 2013 and 2018, and the U.S. has tried all these coup attempts. They failed. So the violent coup attempts have failed. So, and the right-wing opposition can't win at the ballot box fairly. So then the U.S. imposed sanctions. More and more sanctions. This began with Obama. Like many of these policies, it's bipartisan. The sanctions against Venezuela began with Obama. And then when Trump came in, by the way, in 2015, Obama declared Venezuela a, quote, extraordinary threat to the national security of the United States, which is incredible. Like Venezuela is going to bomb the U.S. It's absurd. But that was the justification used to impose more and more sanctions. And then Trump came in 2017. He skyrocketed the sanctions and he imposed a full-on economic embargo, which is a Cuba-style blockade of Venezuela. So suffocating the country, preventing this country that relies on oil exports from exporting its oil, preventing people from buying foreign technology, buying medicine, even buying food. So it's trying to suffocate the country. And this strategy is not new. If people know about CIA operations, in 1970, the people of Chile voted, there was a democratically election, and they voted in a socialist president named Salvador Allende. And he was the first example of a democratically elected socialist president coming to power. And immediately, the Richard Nixon administration, along with war criminal Henry Kissinger, who's almost 100 years old, he'll never die. He made a pact with Satan or something. But Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon, we have recordings of them saying that right after Allende was elected, freely and fairly in Chile, Richard Nixon said in a recording, he said, quote, "Make the economy scream. Make the economy scream." That is still the strategy of the U.S. The U.S. imposed a blockade of Chile in 1970, preventing Chile from selling its copper because the Anaconda Corporation wanted to get access to Chile's copper. Chile has one of the largest copper reserves in the world. And it's the same thing in Venezuela. And now here in Nicaragua, it's the same playbook. The violent coup attempts failed. The right-wing opposition can't win fairly at the ballot box. So now it's economic warfare, make the economy scream. And 3 days before the election here in Nicaragua on November 7th, on November 4th, the U.S. Congress passed the so-called Renacer Act, which is sanctions, more and more sanctions on Nicaragua. 3 days after the election, Biden signed into law the Renacer Act and immediately imposed more sanctions on Nicaragua. And talk about election meddling, by the way, threatening the people of Nicaragua and saying, if you vote for the Sandinistas again, we are going to impose sanctions on you. That's what the U.S. Congress did 3 days before the election. And then 3 days after the election, they did it. They imposed sanctions. So that's the playbook. It's to try to make the economy scream, to try to make people suffer by imposing an economic blockade on the country.
Are you feeling any of these sanctions just on a day-to-day level living there?
Well, yes and no. The sanctions on Nicaragua are not new. I mentioned that there was a violent coup attempt in 2018, and it failed. And so toward the end of 2018, the U.S. Congress, with bipartisan support, of course, passed something called the NICA Act, which, I often point out the NICA Act, the A in NICA, N-I-C-A, already means act. So like the geniuses in Congress wrote a law called NIC Act twice. But anyway, the anti-Cuban, anti-Nicaragua, anti-Venezuela lobby in Miami, a lot of those people are not very smart, as we see with Marco Rubio. So they passed this law in 2018 called the NICA Act, which was sanctions on Nicaragua. And then they sanctioned over the past 3 years, they have sanctioned more and more state institutions. They sanctioned the military. They sanctioned the police. They sanctioned certain banks. And they've sanctioned a lot of government officials. This past week, 2 weeks ago, right after the election, the U.S. government sanctioned top officials, and they also sanctioned the prosecutor's office, like the judicial branch. So every few months, they impose more and more sanctions. So yes, people are starting to feel some economic difficulties, and of course, there's inflation. But right now, there's also a lot of inflation around the world. But another thing that we should keep in mind is that one of the reasons the sanctions against Venezuela have been so devastating, which is it's different in other countries, is that Venezuela is a petrostate. And Venezuela has been a petrostate for over 100 years. Yep. Ever since oil was discovered 100 years ago in Venezuela, the government has relied on oil revenue for the vast majority of the government revenue. I mean, there are taxes, but this is a poor country, so the majority of the revenue comes from oil. And before the Bolivarian Revolution launched by Hugo Chavez, before, all of the oil revenue just went into the pockets of the elites, of the oligarchy, right? But Chavez said, no, we're going to use the oil money to help poor people, to create education and housing and healthcare. So when the U.S. started imposing sanctions on Venezuela, and especially after the U.S. made a deal with Saudi Arabia to massively overpump oil, to overproduce oil, which flooded the market with too much oil, which dropped the price of oil in the global market, which hurt the economy of Russia, Iran, and Venezuela, the main adversaries of the U.S., right? So ever since the U.S. flooded the market with Saudi oil, plummeting the price of oil, this was in the Obama administration, and then the U.S. imposed sanctions on Venezuela. So the Venezuelan economy has been really devastated. A UN expert, the UN Special Rapporteur on Sanctions, recently wrote a report. Again, this is an independent, totally impartial, non-biased UN expert. I'm not being sarcastic. It's truly a non-biased UN expert. She wrote this report, and she said that because of the U.S. sanctions, the Venezuelan government has lost 99% of its government revenue. Wow. That's why the Venezuelan economy is in such shambles. It's not because of socialism. Venezuela had a socialist government from 1998 until the sanctions were imposed in 2015. And it was actually one of the fastest growing economies in Latin America. It was a model for Latin America. Poverty plummeted. Poverty was cut by 2/3. It was actually a model. But with the plummeting prices of oil and with the U.S. sanctions, the Venezuelan economy was starved. The government was starved of 99% of its revenue, and the economy went into free fall. It's very difficult. I've been to Venezuela numerous times, but the government has tried to do what it can, providing food, providing healthcare, providing education to people. It's hard, but they have their basic needs met. Now, the difference in Venezuela and Nicaragua is that Nicaragua doesn't have oil. It does have gas, by the way, and the U.S. is imposing sanctions on the state-owned gas that is trying to sell gas, so that's going to hurt the economy. But Nicaragua is a largely agricultural economy. It doesn't rely on oil exports, and it produces the majority of its food. It produces over 95% of its food. So the strategy going forward is to try to make the economy scream, and there are definitely economic difficulties, but Nicaragua learned from the 1980s when it was under blockade by the U.S., and it learned from Venezuela. So more and more around the world, the U.S. tries to impose more and more sanctions, and it does hurt, but more and more countries around the world are trying to find new ways of doing business, excluding the U.S. dollar. So yes, sanctions do a lot of damage, but the more and more the U.S. uses this weapon of sanctions, the weaker it gets. And as in the years to come, Russia and China, and this is a huge concern of Washington. They're always like, the Russians and the Chinese, they're not allowed to do any business in Latin America. Latin America belongs to us. Well, Russia and China are working closely with countries in Latin America like Venezuela, like Cuba, like Nicaragua, and they're trying to build new alternatives that will prevent the sanctions from doing damage. So the more and more the U.S. attacks, the more and more, ironically, it actually weakens the weapons of economic warfare it has.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for watching. We are still in our 9th month of demonetization from YouTube. So support what we're doing at patreon.com/Graham Elwood or rockfin.com/Graham Elwood, which is a blockchain cryptocurrency platform. It's free to sign up, and there's a premium level at $10 a month. And for that, you get everybody on the platform's premium content. Myself, Lee Camp, Ron Placone, Jimmy Dore, Whitney Webb, Kim Iverson, Abby Martin, and many, many others. You can also support what we're doing at Venmo at Graham-Elwood and go to GrahamElwood.com. We have a PayPal button and a PO box. I also have crypto wallets, which are all in the show notes. Thanks for supporting what we do.